So as you know, we typically try to pick a passage out of something you've just read in the last week or about to read in the next week and try to unpack it together for context, for application, as we make our way through the one-year Bible. And so we're going to maintain that. We're going to do it a bit differently today. Based on the way the schedule has gone over the last few weeks, we really didn't get much time in the book of John. And it's a book that is just so chock full of so many things. We could spend a year of Sundays literally just in the book of John. And so I want to make our way back there some. And so we're going to start with the temple today. But you're going to see how we relate the Old and New Testament and make our way to John from the temple. And so, first of all, when you think of the temple, who do you think of? Solomon. Yeah, Solomon's temple. So you've been reading in 1 Kings. You may recall that I read through the details of the building of Solomon's temple. By the way, I'm going to show several pictures today. You could pick apart details out of any one of these pictures. None of these pictures obviously are meant to be. Yeah, exactly. None of them truly accurately represent, because we don't know, but they're there for visual aids, so take them as nothing more than that. But we've been reading in 1 Kings, and we've seen the construction, the materials, the layout. And so we're going to start here and look at the structure of the temple and make our way into the book of John, into statement of identity of Jesus and how it relates here. And we're going to look at a part of the temple that probably never paid much attention to, but we're given odd details about this part of the temple. And so I want to see how this relates and how it helps our understanding of bringing an increased perspective on the profundity of what Jesus' statements were. They're statements that we can absolutely read them in and of themselves and draw the meaning and the application and the truth from them. But as we know, Jesus very often pulled from his surroundings in the way he spoke to make a point. He used his surroundings, he used the culture, and that's what we want to do today, is try to understand a little more about what would have been his surroundings when he made these statements. Not to draw a different truth, but to just reinforce that truth. And so we're going to be looking at one of the I am statements of Jesus as we do so. In thinking about Jesus being in the temple, we'll get there. Obviously, he's going to be standing in the temple when he speaks. Was it Solomon's temple that he was standing in when he spoke? It was not. It was just Solomon's temple was destroyed, and so we're going to. I'll ask you to bear with me a little bit as we go through some history here to connect from Solomon's temple to the days of Jesus. But it's things that, again, I think are extremely fascinating and good to know our history as relates to where these characters of the Bible fit in. So as we said, Solomon's temple was destroyed, and we'll speak further of that as we connect some of these details. So let's first take a look at the overall structure of the temple. So reading from 1 Kings chapter 6, starting with verse 14, it says, "So Solomon built the temple and completed it. He lined its interior walls with cedar boards, paneling them from floor of the temple to the ceiling, and covered the floor of the temple with planks of juniper. He partitioned off 20 cubits at the rear of the temple with cedar boards from floor to ceiling to form within the temple an inner sanctuary, the most holy place. The main hall in the front of this room was 40 cubits long. The inside of the temple was cedar, carved with gourds and open flowers. Everything was cedar, no stone was to be seen. He prepared the inner sanctuary with the temple to set the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord there. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 wide, and 20 high. He overlaid the inside with pure gold, and he also overlaid the altar with cedar. Solomon covered the inside of the temple with pure gold, and he extended the gold chains across the front of the inner sanctuary, which was overlaid with gold. So he overlaid the whole interior with gold, and he also overlaid with gold the altar that belonged to the inner sanctuary." Sorry, I just realized that slide got cut off there. Just think about what this would have looked like. I think about staying in the cabins in the Smoky Mountains. If you've been to them, they're lined with log, mostly pine. There's some that have cedar, but even pine, it's just absolutely gorgeous, these pine planked walls. So imagine it being in cedar, the red tone there. That alone would have been absolutely gorgeous to walk into this. But notice the detail that it said. After putting all of that, and from a construction material standpoint, cedar is one of the most expensive that you can use today. On top of all that cedar, it says he lined the entire interior of the temple from floor to ceiling in gold. Again, does no justice to probably the real representation, and there's certainly inaccuracies in this picture, but just to try to get some glimpse of what this would have looked like walking into this temple, everything lined in pure gold. This was not gold leaf. So the value of what would have been here, we're told the bronze was beyond measure. The gold here, who knows what the value today would be, but also the beauty. Hard to even fathom what it would have looked like. Anyone know the dimensions of the temple structure? It was 90 feet.
You want that in cubits?
Yeah, exactly. Gotta love reading in cubits. 90 feet long, by 30 feet wide, by 45 feet tall. Again, just trying to get an image of the scale of what the temple was. And that was just the main structure. That didn't count the porches and the side vestibules and what became the courtyards and so many more things through the years that were added to the temple.
It's not very big.
The building itself.
I mean, it probably like this hallway, maybe.
Yeah. Yep.
You always think of, when you hear the word temple, your mind immediately goes to it's enormous when you really picture
what Solomon's temple. Yeah. Solomon's temple, and as we'll see, what eventually became the second temple, very much expanded. So what was the significance of Solomon building this temple?
promised that he would be the one to build it, not his father.
Mm-hmm.
David.
Why was it being built, or did it need to be built?
There's a sense of permanence in that place where, prior to that, they still held the tabernacle from their time in Egypt, or from their time in the desert.
Yeah.
Establishment in the city of David.
Yep. So where did God live prior to the temple? We use the word live loosely. In the tent, in the tabernacle, per his instruction. But he would move with the camp. When he would raise his presence, camp would pack up and move, and he would inform them where to then set up camp, and he would come back down among the tabernacle. But it was a temporary structure.
To make a name for himself.
Mm-hmm. To dwell among the people, to tabernacle or to tent among the people is the meaning of that word. But with the temple, it was significant because it was a permanent place, a permanent home. He had delivered on their promise to bring them out of Egypt and to take them into their promised land, where he would establish them as a nation, and he would have a permanent home, no longer needing to be mobile, if you will. And it was a place of atonement, of covenant. You remember when it was completed, what happened? Showed up very powerfully in thick cloud and smoke that filled the temple so densely that it evacuated the occupants. They could not stand in the concentrated presence of the Lord like that. And so this is how God chose to display his Shekinah glory to them in this temple. But there's also something else very special about this temple. And about the tabernacle itself. Do you know what the book of Hebrews says about the tabernacle and by extension, the temple and their relation to heaven? Book of Hebrews, chapter 8, verse 5. They being priests, sanctuary being the tabernacle, and we're going to extend that to the temple here. But it says, they serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and a shadow of what is in heaven. Think about what that is saying. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle, see to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. So much we could read into both literally and figuratively here. But seeing the temple as a copy and a shadow of what is in heaven, we could do a lesson on that. We're going to sidestep what all that could mean. But that brings very much a gravitas to what was being built here. This was no ordinary structure. These were no ordinary building plans, if you will. And this is why we read in building of the tabernacle, remember Bezalel and Oholiab, who were infused with the skills, the wisdom, the expertise, ability to build everything exactly as God had laid out on the mount for them to build this tabernacle. We're going to look at 1 Kings and we're going to see the same type of language used here in the building of the temple. But it speaks to the importance of what this structure represented. So if we look at 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 13 and 14, it says, King Solomon sent to Tyre and brought Huram, whose mother was a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and whose father was from Tyre, and is a skilled craftsman in bronze. Huram was filled with wisdom, with understanding, and with knowledge to do all kinds of bronze work. He came to King Solomon and did all the work assigned to him. See the same type of language reminiscent of Oholiab with the tabernacle, but we see that this man was filled with wisdom and understanding to bring to completion, again, the very precise specifications of how this temple was to be built. It wasn't just any construction project, like we said. Next couple of verses are going to give us a detail about a particular element of this structure. Continuing verses 15 to 22, it says, he cast 2 bronze pillars, each 18 cubits high and 12 cubits in circumference. He also made 2 capitals of cast bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. Each capital was 5 cubits high. A network of interwoven chains adorned the capitals on top of the pillars, 7 for each capital. He made pomegranates in 2 rows encircling each network to decorate the capitals on top of the pillars. And he did the same for each capital. The capitals on top of the pillars in the portico were in the shape of lilies, 4 cubits high. So what's being described here?
Columns.
Yeah.
Capitals at the top of the column, right? Squared off the top of the column.
Two huge columns, 2 huge pillars. These are also described in verses in 2 Chronicles, but again, gotta love reading in cubits. But these columns, these pillars, each one was 27 feet tall, just the core of the pillar, not including the platform that it would have been or the pedestal that it would have been set on. And then you had on top of that these capitals or these bowls, which were another 7.5 feet tall on top of these. And it's speculated that in all, that the top of these capitals reached nearly 50 feet high. Typical 2-story house, gutter line is, about 20 feet? So you're talking 4 to 5 stories high here with these pillars that stood at the entrance of Solomon's temple. They were 18 feet in circumference. Anybody remember the equation to convert circumference to diameter? Yeah. Pi divided by circumference, I don't know, something like that. They're 6 feet in diameter. This is Bible study, not math class. That's area. So these pillars were impressive in their build, but do you notice the other detail that we get about these pillars? I didn't finish the rest of the verses here. Sorry. On the capitals of both pillars, above the bowl-shaped part next to the network, were 200 pomegranates in a row all around. He erected the pillars at the portico of the temple. The pillars to the south was named Jachin, and the one to the north was Boaz. The capitals on top were in the shape of lilies, and so the work on the pillars was completed. Do you think there's an odd detail in there that we get about these capitals?
It's odd that they named them.
That they name them, yeah. Do you go out and name the columns on your front porch? Probably not.
Well, I do now. I will now.
You will now, yeah. So this, again, I know you can't read all the text on there, but just something of an image of what these pillars could have looked like. But they're named. Jachin was the one to the south, Boaz to the north. Jachin means he establishes, and Boaz means in him is strength. Many think that these were inscribed on these pillars, if not the short description. There's passages from Psalms that each of these are related to those psalms may have been inscribed on these pillars, but we see that as it was a common architectural thing in temples of gods and goddesses that were meant to describe and show the qualities of that god or goddess. But unlike gods of wood and stone, these pillars pointed to living God. In light of what we said about the significance of the building of the temple, what do you think these pillars represented in terms of God's guidance and support for Israel? He establishes, and in him is strength.
You could establish them as a nation.
Mm-hmm.
This is that, there's dispute about Boaz. Some say it's an unknown root, and others say it could be translated fleetness, or his name means fleetness.
Mm-hmm. So many,
One wonders.
yeah, so many tangents we could hit on so many things here. I mean, if we make the parallel to the book of Ruth and Boaz, we're told he was a man of strength. Mm-hmm. If we use that,
I would find meaning from the scripture itself, other uses, because I think that's a stronger argument.
yeah. But God led them out of Egypt. We see many times with an outstretched arm, right, and a strong hand. In him is strength. He established them as a nation, brought them into the land that he promised them. The other thing is these capitals on top of the pillars were referred to as fire bowls. They were bowl shaped. They were called fire bowls because they were filled with oil and kept alight. They were lit on fire. During the time of Solomon's temple, it's said that they never went out. And we know that from the writings of the Mishnah, that these fire bowls were kept constantly lit, symbolizing God leading them in the wilderness with a pillar of fire. There's so many things about this temple structure and even individual pieces like this that, yes, God brought them into this promised land. He established them. He brought a permanent home, but he didn't want them to forget where they came from. How many times throughout the Old Testament do we read the word remember? Remember that I brought you out of Egypt with an outstretched arm and a strong hand, and have set you up here. And so these individual pillars were set up as a remembrance of his strength, of his establishment, and also of his leading, his provision, his guidance through his light in the wilderness. The other thing, it's interesting to think about. As a kid, I always pictured a cloud of fire. I didn't have any other image to go by. But it does state a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. And again, we don't know, but it is interesting to think about what this would have looked like. A column, a pillar of fire leading them in the wilderness. Maybe he led as a vertical pillar of fire like this and a vertical pillar of cloud. It just further adds to the picture and the symbolism of these pillars, this Jachin and Boaz that stood tall in the entrance of the temple. Was the temple significant in their daily life? It's the center of it, wasn't it? In addition to the twice daily sacrifices, it was the center of feasts, of festivities, of celebrations. We'll talk about it in a bit, the feast of Sukkot, Tabernacles. But the Jews believe that the temple is where heaven and earth came together. It's where God chose to make his presence known in a very special manner, where he chose to dwell among his people and make himself specifically known among his people. How do you think the temple affected the identity of the Jewish people?
They were a people of place.
We read, I think even in Solomon's dedication to the temple, that if people ever stray, that they're to repent and turn back and pray in the direction of the temple. And I think that it goes back to this idea that this is the fulfillment of the promise of God. So you're always, everything points back to this idea that God has made his place among and fulfills his promises. And I was thinking about the columns like he establishes and gives us strength. It's Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith. It continually remind them like he establishes, but he's also the sustainer of their nation. So it's just this constant reminder that without him, they're nothing. The reason there are people is because of him. He called them out, he made them, he brought them, and he sustains them. So,
Absolutely.
You'll say it goes back to the permanence. It gave them a sense of establishment, a sense of legitimacy as a nation.
Yeah.
In an earthly sense. You had, Greece had their establishment, Rome had their establishment. This was the nation of Israel, their establishment. This was their, again, legitimacy on earth as a actual nation, not a nomadic people that just roam from place to place.
And so with this symbol of their identity, when everything in their culture, not just their religious identity, but their entire identity as a people. And the two were not separated. We separate them today. In that time, the two were not separated. How is that identity affected when the temple is destroyed? If the people stray, how are they supposed to pray back to that temple? How are they supposed to look back to that central icon, if I can use that word, of their nation? How does that identity stay intact? The temple was destroyed in 586 BC. Jeremiah 52:17 says the Babylonians broke up the bronze pillars. They're specifically mentioned again, which again to me is just an odd detail that you wouldn't typically...
Can I bring in somebody?
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Good morning.
I'm sorry.
How are you?
I'm good, how are you?
It's an odd detail. We would expect to see that the temple was torn down. The temple was destroyed and carried off. But again, these pillars are specifically mentioned. The bronze pillars, the movable stands, and the bronze sea that were at the temple of the Lord, and they carried all the bronze away to Babylon. That's where we're, after this, told that the bronze was immeasurable. But how is that identity affected when this happens? This staple of their identity is destroyed. Do you think that shook them to their core? So let's quickly fast forward and then we'll come back and make the connection here. But you think about when we go from here, when we enter the New Testament, we suddenly start to read about Pharisees and Sadducees and these other religious sects. And we hear about oral tradition and these what we refer to as more restrictive laws. We don't read any of that in the Old Testament. Where did it all come from? All of this began to come about after this temple was destroyed. During this time of exile in Babylon and continuing throughout this intertestamental period, the center of their religious life had been destroyed. It's where they placed identity. They had to adapt. And so during this time of Babylonian exile, they started to debate these same questions. How do we pray back to this temple? It's no longer there. How do we continue sacrifices that God commanded us to do and we have no place to do them? How do we keep Torah when there is no temple ground on which to dwell? And so they began to say, okay, we have the laws of Torah. How do we keep them when we're exiled from our land? And they wanted to keep them so greatly. They put so much gravitas on them. They were trying to uphold what they had been commanded to do. They built what they called a fence around Torah. We want to be so holy. We don't want to break these laws of Torah that we're going to make more restrictive laws so that we don't even get close. If we put a fence around the rules and so we stop ourselves here, that means I can't get here to breaking the laws. And so we're quick to jump on them and criticize and to call it legalistic. And there's certainly truth in that. I'm not saying there's not. But don't miss the fact that all of this began out of them desperately trying to hold on to their religious identity when the temple had been destroyed. They were desperately trying to be holy as he was holy, as he called them to do. And it was their way of getting there. And so most of what we hear referred to as the oral tradition and the Mishnah make up what is called the Babylonian Talmud. And all these things came about during their time of exile in Babylon, from them trying to remain true to their holy God and what they've been called to. And so, again, I want to just trace a quick history now from the time of the temple's destruction to where we're going to arrive in the days of Jesus. If Solomon's temple was destroyed in 586 BC, how was it back? Remember how the temple was rebuilt? Or who rebuilt it?
You were allowed to go back.
Yeah, at the decree of Cyrus. We read in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that Zerubbabel and others had come back. They rebuilt the walls. They rebuilt the temple. Estimated that it was completed about 515 BC. And again, we read of a very similar ceremony where God came down and consecrated that temple as well. Couple hundred years later, in the 300s BC, we hear of Alexander the Great comes onto the scene. Alexander the Great began to rule, and he initially allowed the Jews to have religious freedom, but he saw an early death. Died right around the age of 30. Many believe in a drunken stupor, which led to a heart attack. But when he died, the Seleucids came into power, and the Seleucids were not as understanding with the Jewish people. And so the Seleucid king Antiochus, he desecrated the temple in 167 BC. He came in and did what was just an extreme obscenity. He took an unclean animal, a pig, and sacrificed it on the altar. Many believe that is what was referred to as the abomination of desolation that was prophesied in the book of Daniel. But this was the Seleucid king Antiochus in 167 BC who did that, who desecrated their temple and then began to rule the people, remove their religious freedom, and oppress the Jews. This led to the Maccabean revolt. It's not part of our canon. You will find it in some translations of the Bible, but you hear it referred to as the Apocrypha, a collection of books that are not canon, but have as much legitimacy as any history book you learned U.S. history from in high school. There's 4 books in the Apocrypha, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees, which are just, if you like history, they're so fascinating. It's all about the time of Alexander the Great and this intertestamental period and the Maccabean revolt, the desecration of the temple, but then also it's taking back. So this Maccabean revolt was successful, and in 164 BC, the temple was again rededicated. Anybody know what festival was founded when that temple was rededicated in 164 BC? Hanukkah. So Hanukkah, when we're learning about the feasts of the Jews right now in Leviticus that Pastor Heath is teaching on, you don't see Hanukkah listed. Where did it come from? It came from here, intertestamental period, when after the Maccabean revolt was succeeded, they took back their nation. They went in and rededicated the temple from where it had been desecrated. Hanukkah was born, if you will. Who was in power during the time of Jesus? Who ruled Israel? Rome. So where did they come from? Well, in 63 BC, Rome invaded under the leadership of Pompey and began to rule, and really placed Herod as a puppet king about 20 BC. So he was king, but he was a puppet for Rome. And this is where we find ourselves in the days of Jesus. One thing Herod did, though, he did allow the religious freedom of the Jews. He kept his hands out, but he wanted to play a part. And so Herod is credited for turning the temple into the wonder that it was in the ancient world. Herod decreed and financed for Temple Mount to be expanded, literally bringing in earth. Who knows how they did it in that time without heavy equipment, but they literally expanded Temple Mount, brought in earth, put up retaining walls, expanded the footprint so that they had room to build bigger courtyards, expanding the footprint of the temple into what we saw in the days of Jesus, but added gates, added elaborate decorations, added courtyards, and turned it into an architectural marvel. According to Josephus, Jewish historian, made it one of the most impressive structures of the ancient world. And so this is where we find ourselves in the days of Jesus. You'll remember comments from the disciples on how impressive the temple was. Some of his disciples from Luke 21 were remarking how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God. In Mark it says, look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. This was describing the temple. It was massive. Now you can't see all the detail here, but if you look at the top right hand, the little rectangle to the left is a U.S. football field. To the right is the footprint of the temple. So if you put a couple of them horizontally and a football field vertically, you're roughly 3 football fields in size now with all the courtyard structures. But it was praised for its beauty, and somewhat rightfully so, not as a structure, but as a representation of the one true God, which it was meant to glorify. It's where they believed heaven and earth came together, where God chose to make his presence specially known. And so we insert ourselves here. Just to round out our history, this temple was then destroyed in 70 AD by Rome. As we go through that history, how might the changes and the challenges that the temple faced have affected the faith of the Jewish people? Think it shook it from time to time? We're going to have to move quickly so we can bring all this together, but we're going to insert ourselves now into this Herod's temple, time of Jesus, and it's the festival of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. If you remember what he's been teaching through on the festivals. It was one of 3 pilgrimage festivals where every Israelite who could, made their way back to Jerusalem and back to the temple. It would have been, the city was absolutely packed. It was the longest of the festivals. It was celebrated at the end of harvest season, but it was the festival that was specifically made to commemorate the sojourning of Israel in the wilderness. And so they again have this permanent home now, but they were never to forget their wanderings in the desert as a people. And so it was called the Feast of Tabernacles, or booths. Israelites would set up temporary tent structures and live in them for the duration of this festival in remembrance of how they lived in the desert. And it was a celebration of God's provision and guidance during that time. For time's sake, I'm going to skip some of this, but you'll find this feast in Leviticus 23, verses 39 to 43 and surrounding verses. But I'm going to read just the last part of that. It says, on the first day, you are to take branches from luxuriant trees, from palms, willows, and other leafy trees, and rejoice before the Lord for 7 days. Celebrate this as a festival to the Lord. Going on, it says, live in temporary shelters for 7 days so that your descendants will know that I had the Israelites live in temporary shelters when I brought them out of Egypt. So I want to bring some context to this festival and how it was celebrated now. And all this comes from Mishnah and the writings, specifically the book of Sukkot, if you wanted to look it up, but also from the Jewish New Testament commentary. And again, it's not scripture, but we have every ability to rely on this just like we would a history book, and it brings so much context here. So we're going to go into John chapter 7 and 8 here. Festival of Booths is being celebrated in the temple. And let's try to put ourselves into this scene. During Sukkot, it was a pilgrimage feast. So again, the city was packed full. And each day of the feast, there was a water drawing ceremony. If you look at the very bottom of this picture, you see that little dot of blue. That is the pool of Siloam. And you see the path that winds up to the lower left gate of Temple Mount there. There was a water drawing ceremony that took place once a day during this festival, and a priest would go down with a golden pitcher, draw water from the pool of Siloam, and in procession, in celebration, would make his way up this path into the temple and would pour it into a basin at the foot of the altar. And the temple, you couldn't have fit another person in there. Estimates of 1 million people just in the temple. And then that path would have been just lined shoulder to shoulder in celebration and watching this procession. During this time, the enormous crowds would work themselves into a frenzy of celebration. From what we just read, they were told to wave branches from palms and other leafy trees. You ever taken a branch and waved it in the air? You know how noisy it can be? Imagine millions of people waving these branches. They would sway, they would wave these branches, they would chant from the Psalms. They would work themselves into a religious frenzy. The Mishnah said that he who had never seen this ceremony had never seen true joy. The word ecstasy was used to describe what would have been seen in these celebrations. And so this procession would take place once a day. At the evening, after the night of the first day, 4 golden menorahs would be set up in the courtyard, setting Jachin and Boaz back up. Very similar imagery here. So these 4 golden menorahs would be set up. It says they were 75 feet tall. Had golden bowls at the top that would hold 7.5 gallons of oil, and they would be lit the evening of the first night, and they would stay lit through the remainder of the festival. Again, remembering God's provision.
Why 4?
Good question. I have no idea. But they were 75 feet tall. They towered in the skyline, and the book of Sukkot says there was not a courtyard in Jerusalem that was not lit up from the lights coming from these 4 menorahs. And the people would dance around them, singing with harps and cymbals and trumpets and other instruments. This would take place every day. The water drawing ceremony during the day, the evening celebration around the menorahs. Water and light played a significant role in the celebration of Sukkot. They symbolize God's provision, providing of water in the wilderness, water coming from the rock. And the rabbis associate it with Isaiah 12:3, which says, "With joy you shall draw water from the wells of salvation." And that's what they were doing in picture when they would draw from the pool of Siloam and bringing it in the temple. Also celebrating light. Light was commemorating God's leading with a pillar of fire. Light was guidance. It was protection. It was the presence of God. On the final day, all of this would climax. On the final day, adding to the waving of branches, the swaying, the chanting, during this water drawing ceremony, for the entirety of the ceremony, priests would gather and blow golden trumpets the entire time. Again, put yourself into this frenzy of noise and celebration. It's what they were commanded to do. As the priest would make his way up into the temple, you had this just cacophony of noise and things taking place, the frenzied crowd. As the priest would walk into the temple, he'd reach the basin, he'd raise the pitcher in the air, and silence would fall amongst the crowd. Imagine if it were right then that John 7 takes place. Probably the only time it could have taken place culturally. On the last and greatest day of the festival, John is silent on all this culture that we just went through, but his readers would have got it. That's why he could be silent.
It was understood.
But it's understood and he makes sure we know it's on the last and greatest day when all of this climaxed, when the priest raised this pitcher and silence went over this frenzied crowd. Jesus cried out. He yelled in a loud voice, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." What was he saying? I was the water in the desert. I was the one who provided it from the rock. And I'm standing in front of you here today. Everything you are celebrating, everything you are remembering, you do good to do it, but I'm standing right here. If you're thirsty, come to me and drink. He was saying from Isaiah 51, "Come, all you who are thirsty, come to the waters. You who have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost." Did his hearers understand what he was saying? We don't have time to go through it this morning, but if you read the next verses, they immediately got it, because some wanted to kill him, some believed, but they immediately began to debate. Is this the Messiah? They knew exactly what he was saying. But as we continue on, he didn't stop there. And apologies how quickly we're moving. There's so much more to be said here. But he was saying one greater than the temple is here. One greater than Solomon is here. The living water that never runs dry is here. Later that day, we're told, now it's evening. The menorahs are lit. There's dancing. There's singing. Not a courtyard in Jerusalem is darkened. Lit up here. With that as the backdrop, Jesus further announces. It says, when he spoke to the people again, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. How powerful are these statements when we understand what was taking place around Jesus at the time and what he was saying to the people. He is the light of life. John has told us that from chapter 1, right? In him was life. The life was the light of all mankind. He shines in the darkness. And Jesus is saying, I'm right here. Again, you do well to remember and to celebrate, but the light of the world is standing right here. He is the fulfillment of everything that they are celebrating. He is the fulfillment of Isaiah's words in chapter 9. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. Those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. And so as we wrap up here, what should the people have heard loud and clear? We said earlier that the temple was a shadow and a copy. What were they a shadow and a copy of? Him. He was their architect, but he was also their fulfillment, is their fulfillment. He is the center of their life. The temple was a representation. We discussed earlier the challenges that the temple faced through the years. How's Jesus different? Can Jesus be destroyed? Can he be desecrated? Can he be removed from their culture? An identity in him cannot be shaken like an identity in the temple was time and time again. And that's the same truth that we can live by today. What does it mean to come to Jesus and drink? What does it mean to live, looking to him as the light of the world? For not walking in light, what's the alternative? Darkness, where there's hopelessness, confusion, depression, angst, despair, longing. John 1 says, he is the light of all mankind. None of these things can overcome light. What does light do to darkness? It dispels it. Light banishes darkness and allows us to see things for the way they really are. In darkness, you are not seeing clearly, which is why all these things come to be. So in light, instead of hopelessness, you have hope. Instead of confusion, you have clarity. Instead of despair, there's joy. Instead of longing, there's fulfillment. Instead of angst, there's contentment. This is what Jesus brings as the center of our lives. Just as the temple was the center of theirs, Jesus is to be at the center of our life. Just as we said about the celebrations of Sukkot, may we live in such a way that people have never seen joy like that of one who is following Christ. So I know we got quick there at the end. Apologies, had to skip over quite a bit, but I hope this look at the temple and of Sukkot maybe prompts you to take a closer look and helps add to the context and the significance of exactly what was Jesus saying to the people and what they would have heard, given the full context of where and when Jesus said it, because where and when is just as important as what he was saying.